Hello YouTube. Today, something a little more interesting. We've got a Zorki 5 here, in parts, obviously. And a little bit of background on this. I got it on eBay. I took an $8 chance on a beat up camera. It actually wasn't that beat up. It looked pretty good, but it didn't work. I got the camera, and I'll put the cover on here for you. I got the camera and the shutter didn't work right. So I took the camera, the top off the camera and the bottom. And at the end of this video I'm going to try and put a slideshow on of me taking the top off the camera. It's relatively straightforward and fairly simple. A couple of things you do want to watch out for is when I got the camera, the hot shoe had been removed. You don't have to take the hot shoe off to take the top off. Somebody had taken the top off, and there's a plate on the inside. I'll show you that. I think you can see that. There's a plate right there that the hot shoe screws to. When you take the hot shoe, it's actually a cold shoe. When you take the cold shoe off, that plate on the inside drops down inside, and if you don't take the cover off, you're never going to find it again. And it'll just be loose, flopping around inside the works here. So it is not necessary to take the cold shoe off to get the top off the camera. The only real thing that got me a little concerned was on top of, and you'll see in the slideshow, on top of all this winder stuff, there's a smooth ring right around the shutter release button. It's left-hand thread, and may or may not be pretty stuck, and there's pictures in the slideshow showing you what I did to get it off. I lucked out with this because the camera had obviously been apart before, and everything was not exactly cranked down as tight as it might be from the factory. And you can always tell when a camera's been apart before, because the screw heads in various things will be a little more chewed up. There'll be scratches and scrapes on various parts. There's a big flat ring that has to be screwed down, which is also left-hand thread, and it was obviously scratched up and scraped from having been removed. So I knew the camera had been apart before, and somebody either couldn't fix it or didn't know what they were doing or whatever. It had been apart before. A couple of things I wanted to show you while my digital technology is holding out. The problem, as far as I can tell, the problem I was having was that this, let me see if I can get you a good view here. There's a crescent-shaped arm right here that is spring tension from a spring right here. When you wind up the shutter, and hopefully you can see right here the speed control, it spins, it does its magic, and there's a tab, a lobe on the cam that sits into a corresponding notch in this crescent shaped doodad. I don't know what the right names for all these parts are, so bear with me. And when you release the shutter, you'll see that whole gizmo spins, and as you press down the shutter, you'll see, watch this thing, you'll see that also goes down with the shutter release. So you wind up the shutter, you have a lobe stuck in the notch, release the shutter, this crescent shaped piece syncs with the shutter release button like that, holds that lobe in place, and that is your delay on the second curtain closing. And you'll see, if you can see, the shutter curtain is open. The first curtain has gone and wound up. Second curtain is waiting for me to release the shutter button. This is you can't tell, I'm sure, from the image quality, but this, I've moved this thing around to the bulb position so it'll stay open as long as I hold the shutter release. So you release the button, and the second curtain closes. What I decided, because I couldn't find any real information on this, was that the shutters themselves were cranked up. These are the adjustment bolts. Were cranked up too tight, so the second curtain was just applying too much pressure or too much tension to this sprung shaft, and was making it spin so fast and hard that it was skipping right past the lobe here. It was skipping right past this notch. So I adjusted, long story short, I adjusted the shutter curtains. I slowed them down a little bit, and I cleaned it out. I got a bunch of crud out of it. I took my compressed air, I blew out all the stuff that I could find on the inside. I put a few dots of oil here and there on pivot points. I cleaned a bunch of crud off of the gears. Now, a good camera mechanic would have taken all this stuff apart and really done a thorough job of cleaning. I am not that good, so I just did what I could do by looking basically on the surface. And I got my little oiler in there, and I oiled up gears. I did all that stuff. But that's what I wanted to show you. That was the problem I was having, because both curtains, when you hit the shutter release button, both curtains would just shoot right across. You were basically trying to take a picture with a closed curtain, closed shutter, as you see it. And now, through a few adjustments, I've gotten it so it fires pretty good. There are ways of testing shutter speeds. I don't know any of them. Also, when I first took the cover off, I fished out that little plate, the cold shoe. I also discovered that this arm I just showed you wasn't in its proper position. It wasn't sitting down like you hopefully can see here. It was actually sticking up about this far, which means it can't do its job with the cam, and it's not anchored in the bottom. It's a shaft that runs down the full length, and it actually hits this right here is a one big spring. And when you press the shutter release button, maybe you can see that spring flexing. Well, this thing, this crescent shaped doodad, runs through the body of the camera and is also resting on this. So they both are reactive when you press the shutter release button. It's got a spring here that holds it not just down but in towards the cam on your shutter speed control. So I don't have a lot of definite information to share with you about this. I just wanted to show you a quick overview. The slideshow, I think, is pretty detailed. So hopefully if you've got one of these and you want to get the top off to do some work to it, that'll help you. Take your time, have good tools, and just be cautious, and you should be fine. These are pretty good to work on. The directions that I followed, which were for a Zorki 6, which is very similar to the 5, although not exact. It shows you taking out these 3 screws on the shutter arm itself, and that holds a bottom plate on that has a bunch of little tiny stuff in it that allows it to ratchet. If I was going to do this again, I would not take those 3 screws out because you don't really have to. It's only holding a bottom plate on there, and this is actually held in place by a shouldered, I'm going to call it a collar nut. It's got a little shoulder that sticks out there and holds this in place. So taking those 3 screws out. Okay, digital technology failed me again. But the bottom line was, on a 5, I would not take these 3 screws out again because they don't have to come out. They don't hold anything except this bottom plate in place. If you take off that shouldered nut that is a left-handed thread, you get that unscrewed. Actually, turn it to the right. You get that unscrewed, that whole assembly will come off by itself. So there's one less thing you have to take apart and get a whole bunch of tiny little stuff to line up again. And also, when you get the counter cover off here, you'll notice that there's the tab of a spring hooked through this hole right here. And what I read online, which was a great great thing, I don't remember the username, but the forum was Rangefinder forum, I believe it was called. In any case, you'll see the end of a spring, which is the winder return spring. You can just drop that spring right down through its hole, and you're not going to hurt anything. It's a loose spring, coils around here, and anchors to this screw right here, and you'll see that in the slideshow. So I was a little bit hesitant about that, and that's one of the reasons why I took these 3 screws out, was to be a little more cautious as I proceeded. And it turns out I really could just take that spring. Once I get that shouldered nut off, I could have just lifted it a little bit and popped that spring right down through the hole and been fine. And then there you have it. And then this cogged wheel will lift off, does no harm, meshes right back up again. And that is pretty much all I wanted to show you. I don't really have any more information to give you. Again, this is a Zorki 5. This happens to be an early model. There are I believe two lines, early and late, and a handful of variations, but they're all basically the same thing. So if you have one, you've got yourself kind of a cool piece of history and what might be a heck of a good camera. So until next time, good luck. Oh, and bear in mind, this is a great way to destroy your camera. Until next time. One more thing, Facebook. I'm going to do this handheld just to show you a small thing. Internet lore says that you should never, on a Zorki 5, advance the frame or wind up the shutter, whatever you want to call it, without a lens on the camera. And you'll see right there, that's the little arm that adjusts the focus. And if you can see, right here is the pivot point and the arm that moves the prism that creates your focus. And as you move that gently, you'll see that thing move. What I've read on the internet says that you should never advance the frame without a lens on the camera, and the reason being that apparently it's theorized that doing that can make, I don't know how to explain this, all these lobes on the shutter speed crank around as you advance the shutter. Now without the lens on the camera, at some point it can bump the lobes here, can bump this arm here. I've been fiddling around with this thing and experimenting with it, and I don't see any real concern that you could actually do some damage. It might interfere with the way the shutter releases. As that lobe comes around, it could possibly strike this arm, slowing down your shutter release. As you wind up, it could bump the arm also and momentarily mess with your focus. Not your focus through the lens, but your focus through the viewfinder. I haven't seen that there's any real concern for any real damage. However, in the interest of caution, I would say the same thing. If at all possible, have a lens on the camera when you advance the frame, or reach in very gently and just depress that little tab just a little bit to get that arm out of the way. If you can see it moving, I hope you can. Depress it just a little bit and get that arm out of the way of the lobe as it swings around when you're either advancing or releasing the frame. And that's all I wanted to add to this.